I call this hearing of the Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee to order. I am pleased to welcome everyone here today for this very important and timely hearing on the Department of Defense DoD Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction CWMD policy and programs for the fiscal year 2017. The proliferation and potential use of weapons of mass destruction remains a grave and enduring threat. Adversaries of the United States continue to pursue weapons of mass destruction in an attempt to enhance their international influence and threaten the American people, both at home and abroad. Recent media reports on the use of these weapons are widespread. They include news of Daesh's use of chemical weapons in Iraq and Syria, revolutionary advances in biotechnology, and the continued nuclear weapon development of North Korea. These reports highlight the diverse and continued threats posed by weapons of mass destruction to the United States and our allies. The entire Department of Defense Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction enterprise is critical in preventing, protecting against, and responding to the weapons of mass destruction threats. While the Department of Defense has made many important contributions to national security over the last year, there are challenges to the countering weapons of mass destruction enterprise that still must be addressed. The inadvertent shipment of inactivated anthrax from the Dugway Proving Ground to 194 laboratories in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, 3 territories, and 9 foreign countries, has exposed scientific, institutional, and workforce problems that need to be addressed to prevent this from ever happening again. We also remain increasingly concerned about the proliferation of dual-use technologies that could potentially be used for WMD development activities. These dual-use technologies could make threats much more readily available to terrorist groups or even lone actors, domestically as well as abroad. So today we look forward to discussing the priorities for the Department of Defense to counter these evolving weapons of mass destruction threats for fiscal year 2017. We have before us a panel of 3 distinguished witnesses: Dr. Arthur Hopkins, performing the duties of the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Nuclear, Chemical, and Biological Defense Programs; Mr. Kenneth Myers, Director of the Defense Threat Reduction Agency and the U.S. Strategic Command Center for Combating Weapons of Mass Destruction; and Dr. Wendin D, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction. I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize the outstanding service of Director Ken Myers, who will be moving on from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency next month. During his leadership as the longest-serving director in the history of the organization, the agency has expanded international operations, increased research and development cooperation, and transformed into a whole-of-government resource. Ken's contributions have been critical in safeguarding our nation and our allies, and we wish him best of luck in future endeavors. I'd now like to turn to my friend and the ranking member, Congressman Jim Langevin of Rhode Island, for any comments he'd like to make.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you to all our witnesses for appearing before the subcommittee today to provide testimony on fiscal year 2017 budget request for countering weapons of mass destruction and associated programs and policies. As we know, many state and non-state actors seek to develop, proliferate, acquire, or use weapons of mass destruction against our service members, allies, and innocent civilians overseas and here in the homeland. In late 2015, our subcommittee received a briefing from the intelligence community detailing the myriad WMD threats and associated actors. While I cannot go into details of that in this briefing, one needs to look no further than today's headlines outlining ISIL's aspirations to acquire and use chemical weapons, North Korea's provocative actions, and global impact of the Zika virus to understand how real chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats are and how widespread their impact can be. Technological advancements often work in our favor, but they also work in our adversaries' favor. Today's hearing will provide insight on how we are investing in science and technology to provide better capabilities to our warfighter and shaping our approach to this threat. I support a robust S&T investment in the ChemBio defense programs and hope to learn today why that budget request has been decreased by approximately $30 million compared to last year, while other S&T budgets in the department have increased substantially. Equally important is reducing redundancy and achieving efficacy. For instance, a WMD situational awareness tool called Constellation is being prototyped, yet it remains unclear exactly how this program differs from others being used today and in development. Last week, the subcommittee heard from the Blue Ribbon panel on their biodefense report. I found many of the findings and recommendations thought-provoking and look forward to hearing the department's feedback. I would like to note, however, that many of the recommendations can and should also be applied to the chemical, nuclear, and radiological enterprise as well. I've long been an advocate also for cybersecurity. I believe that cybersecurity must be a key component of all strategies, and was pleased to see that the panel included recommendations pertaining to the management of cyber threats to pathogen and biological information. Again, I would stress this recommendation should be applied across the enterprise. With respect to the department's inadvertent shipment of anthrax, I expect to learn more about the scientific, institutional, and cultural changes being implemented within the department as a result of the lessons that we have learned from this serious incident. Finally, although the authority is not just overseen by this subcommittee, I want to close by expressing support for the Cooperative Threat Reduction Program. Biological agents, once released, know no boundaries. ISIL has freedom of movement across large swaths of the Middle East, near our allies like Jordan, and near where our troops are stationed. Improving our foreign partners' capability to secure and dispose of WMD materials is in the best interest of our troops, our allies, innocent civilians, and ultimately the homeland. The witness's testimony provides examples of the contributions to national security that have been made under this program, and I look forward to hearing more. There is no one more familiar with this authority than Director Myers, and like the chairman, I want to congratulate you on all your accomplishments and on your new endeavors. He's led the Defense Threat Reduction Agency through extraordinary times, during which we have seen the destruction of Syria's chemical weapons aboard a ship, among other milestones. And Director Myers, let me say that you will certainly be missed. I also say that I've had the opportunity to have you testify before both this subcommittee as well as the Intelligence Committee as well as the Homeland Security Committee, and your contributions have always been well received and insightful. So with that, I thank you for your service, and that, Mr. Chairman, I want to thank our panel for appearing before us today, and thank you for all the work that you do to protect our nation, our partners, and our service members. Thank you very much, and with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Langevin. And our format today, each of you, we look forward to your testimony. When that concludes, we will begin rounds of questioning at 5 minutes each, strictly enforced by Jackie Sutton. And then, remarkably enough, we might even have time, and what you're dealing with is so important to all of us that we could actually have a second round. And so we'll begin with Dr. Hopkins.
Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Langevin, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I appreciate this opportunity to testify on the Department's efforts to counter the threats posed by weapons of mass destruction and to provide context for the President's fiscal year 17 budget request. Our budget request includes resources to reduce threats and protect warfighters in several areas. The Chemical and Biological Defense Program budget request will continue the development of capabilities to protect against chemical, biological, and radiological threats. Our Chemical Demilitarization Program will continue to ensure the safe, complete, and treaty-compliant destruction of the United States chemical weapons stockpile. Our Nuclear Matters resources will support the development of policies that guide the safety and security of the nation's nuclear deterrent and help to counter threats of nuclear terrorism and proliferation. The Defense Threat Reduction Agency budget request includes resources to address the full spectrum of WMD-related threats, including cooperative threat reduction programs and support to combatant commands. Finally, our Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Systems program will enhance situational awareness of WMD activities globally. The Chemical and Biological Defense Program includes research, development, testing, and fielding of medical countermeasures, that is, advanced vaccines and therapeutic drugs. It includes advanced diagnostics, environmental detection, protective equipment, and hazard mitigation capabilities. In domestic chemical demilitarization, the Department continues to make significant progress in meeting the nation's commitments under the Chemical Weapons Convention by eliminating our remaining chemical weapons stockpiles in Colorado and Kentucky. In March 2015, the Department started agent destruction operations at the Pueblo, Colorado site. At Bluegrass, Kentucky, facility construction is complete and destruction systems are being tested. With respect to nuclear threats, the Department works with other departments and agencies to strengthen the nation's capability to detect and respond to nuclear proliferation. The Cooperative Threat Reduction's Global Nuclear Security Program establishes and maintains nuclear security cooperation with several countries. With respect to this nation's nuclear stockpile, the Domestic Nuclear Weapons Accident Incident Exercise Program continues as the premier interagency training event. It enhances the whole-of-government ability to maintain the security of our nuclear weapons. The Department's Cooperative Threat Reduction Program and capacity-building efforts help to identify potential threats globally, and they enable early actions that will prevent or mitigate them. The CTR program's effectiveness was most recently highlighted by its contribution to the timely confirmation of the first resurgent case of Ebola. The Department maintains strong relationships with allied nations to help reduce biological threats. The Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction Systems portfolio is leading the development of a situational awareness information system called Constellation. That system will enable the consolidation, the analysis, and the sharing of timely and relevant information. Constellation is being developed by Defense Threat Reduction Agency with support from Defense Intelligence Agency. It will support analysis, planning, and decision-making by the combatant commands and their interagency and international partners. Our 2017 budget request includes resources to take Constellation from development to an operational prototype. The Department's Countering WMD activities support a broad spectrum of activities that help reduce threats from weapons of mass destruction. We strengthen program effectiveness and ensure efficiencies by acting in collaboration and coordination with numerous interagency and international partners. The President's 17 budget request will enable us to continue to perform that mission effectively. Thank you again for this opportunity to testify today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hopkins. We now proceed with Mr. Myers.
Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Langevin, and members of the subcommittee. It is an honor to be here today to share with you the work we do to make the world safer by countering the threats posed by the proliferation and use of weapons of mass destruction. The Defense Threat Reduction Agency is a unique place with a broad portfolio. In fact, the vast majority of the activities that my colleagues beside me will discuss today are carried out by DTRA. We have a rich history. Our roots go back to the Manhattan Project, where we provided expertise in analyzing weapons effects, work that we still do today. DTRA was created because of the existential threat posed by weapons of mass destruction. The consequences of a major attack on our country are almost unimaginable, with potentially devastating impact. Those who wish to harm us understand that the use of such weapons could result in immense loss of life and enduring economic, political, and social damage on a global scale. As a defense agency, DTRA reports to Undersecretary Frank Kendall in providing research and development and capabilities. As a combat support agency, DTRA is under the control of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and provides direct support to combatant commanders and the services. Our expertise spans the full WMD threat spectrum: chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear weapons, and high-yield explosives. We are a one-stop shop, open 24 hours a day to support the warfighter and the rest of the interagency. We are the only U.S. government entity with this type of unique concentration in this critical mission area. Terrorists have clearly demonstrated that they will use any weapons or materials at their disposal, and for them, no targets are off limits. In addition, WMD-related events are occurring more often and in real time. While not an attack, the most recent example of this was the Ebola outbreak. The panic caused by Ebola was not just felt in Africa. The outbreak raised legitimate concerns all over the world. In the United States, there was a nonstop news cycle persisting for months and genuine fear in our communities. And the United States only had 4 confirmed cases. Now just imagine if the outbreak hadn't been controlled, or if we had been dealing with a new genetically modified biothreat. Nearly every year, we face a new WMD-related crisis. Fukushima, Libya, Syria, Ebola. We cannot easily plan or budget for these types of situations. This requires us to surge our efforts and reprioritize resources. Thankfully, the unique authorities and funding that Congress provides to us each year allows us to respond to these challenges. Thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Director Myers. We now proceed to Dr. Smith.
Chairman Wilson, Ranking Member Langevin, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to testify today. I'm honored to be here with Dr. Hopkins and Director Myers to present the department's approach. In line with our 2014 strategy for countering WMD, my office develops policy and guidance, supports and coordinates interagency initiatives, and contributes to international efforts focused on the 3 pillars of that strategy. The first is preventing acquisition of WMD, second, containing and reducing those threats, and third, maintaining our capabilities to respond. Underpinning each of those is a constant cycle of preparation. Today's complex security environment has made countering WMD threats ever more challenging and multidimensional. We face threats from state and increasingly non-state actors who have access to knowledge and emerging technologies. It is critical to prepare for these emerging challenges, including WMD threats that evolve from advances in some of those areas such as synthetics, cyber tools, unmanned systems, and additive manufacturing. We must continually exercise flexibility and creativity in our approaches. Ensuring that those who do not currently have WMD capabilities do not obtain them is a key component of our counter-WMD effort. As we've heard today, based on available information, we believe that the Islamic State of Iraq and Levant was responsible for some of the alleged attacks using sulfur mustard in the past year. We've been working proactively with our allies and partners to deny ISIL or its affiliates and other non-state actors with access to any of these CBRN materials. The international coalition combating ISIL will consider all elements of power to pursue those who use any of these CBRN capabilities. We also work with our allies and partners to strengthen the security of materials that are at risk of theft or diversion. And through the CTR, Cooperative Threat Reduction Program, we've had a decades-long track record of working successfully with foreign partners to destroy WMD, to make those materials more difficult to acquire, and to detect and interdict dangerous components and materials. In line with our strategy, CTR has evolved from a focus on initially efforts in the former Soviet Union to now a response in this emerging threat environment. We also work closely with our partners in the Department of State to support international regimes such as the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Biological Weapons and Toxins Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, and clearly the Proliferation Security Initiative now in its 13th year. So despite our best efforts to prevent actors from obtaining WMD, we must nevertheless contend too often with reducing and containing those threats. Here we look often to CTR, which again has had great successes in working with partners. Some examples in the past year: Ukraine, Jordan, Lebanon, and other important areas. Also consistent with our strategy, we assist partners in proactively confronting emerging threats in regions that are also of emerging concern. One of those is North Africa. In response to the use of chemicals as weapons in both Iraq and Syria, coupled with growing encroachment of extremist groups, we have initiated proliferation prevention programs in cooperation with the government of Tunisia and plan to implement a border surveillance system along its most vulnerable areas in FY17. Ultimately, it's not enough to prevent, reduce, and contain the WMD. We also must be prepared to respond. We will therefore continue to work with our partners, both internationally and domestically, to manage and respond to threats from North Korea, and will remain vigilant in supporting interagency efforts to monitor and prevent Iran from acquiring WMD material. Complementing these efforts is the CBRN Preparedness Program, or CP2 program, which works with partner nations to respond to and mitigate the effects of a CBRN incident. In FY15, the DoD program provided response training and equipment to civilian and military first responders in a number of countries. And as we look forward to the next year, we will continue to improve WMD preparedness and response capabilities of key partners whom we identify collaboratively with the combatant commanders and the Department of State. So despite the progress I've described here, we can't be complacent. We continue to adapt and respond to those static and emerging threats, and we must continue to anticipate those threats again from both state and non-state actors. So as we move forward, your continued support for and funding in these areas will be critical to our ability, and we appreciate your support. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Smith. We now will proceed to have a round of questions, beginning with myself and Mr. Myers. Later this year, the Joint Improvised Threat Defeat Agency will transition under the authority, direction, and control of the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. Can you provide an update on the status of this transition plan? How do you plan to maintain the important expertise in counter-improvised explosive devices through the transition?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yes, as you explained, the Joint Improvised Threat Destruction Agency will move in and come in under the Defense Threat Reduction Agency. Lieutenant General Michael Shields is the director of JIDA at this time. He and I have been working very carefully and closely together. We have very specific orders and instructions from Undersecretary Kendall, and that is to ensure that the counter-WMD space and the counter-improvised threat reduction space continue to succeed at the rate they have been succeeding in the past. In other words, he expects both to take full advantage of the benefits and the potential coordination and complementary nature of some of the aspects of the two mission areas. He expects us to be advancing both of these missions. Right now, we are looking very carefully at opportunities where the two organizations might come together and integrate, but we're taking a very slow process. We want to make sure that each step we take is complementary to both mission areas. There may be areas that cannot be brought in together, and we want to make sure that those areas are preserved to ensure that the warfighter continues to receive the outstanding service in both the counter-WMD as well as the counter-improvised threat device arena. And we're confident with the process that we have in place, we will reach such a place.
And I want to thank you. Actually, personally, my oldest son conducted cross-country convoys in Iraq. And so I know firsthand how important your efforts have been. Dr. Smith, there's been a lot of discussion about the fact that biotechnology is widely proliferated now, which could make biothreats much more readily available to terrorist groups or even lone actors, domestically as well as abroad. And I'm particularly concerned with the occupation for almost 2 years now of such a large city as Mosul, with 1 million people, that there are laboratories that could be easily used to create weapons of mass destruction. How does this change of strategy affect our ability to protect the American people from biothreats?
Thank you for the question, and an excellent one. Clearly, our strategy, which I referred to at the beginning of my remarks, is designed to account, again, for both state and non-state actors, any lone actor, ideally in that mix as well, although it gets much harder at that end of the spectrum. So again, we foremost focus on preventing acquisition from the start. So in the case of these international partners where our efforts focus, that's the most important step, is preventing the acquisition at the beginning of either the materials or the know-how. So both being aware of where those capabilities exist and then having collaborative partnerships with entities within those countries that are cooperative through our CTR programs is critical. And again, anticipating that that may not always succeed, particularly in these cases of a non-state actor. We have to be better prepared then to contain and then respond to a threat should it exist. So that's where, again, the programs we have support the detection, surveillance, information sharing, active engagement with our partners in country such that we can better be aware of an evolving threat. But it's certainly, as I made in my opening remarks, a mounting challenge. The spread of technology and the accessibility of that technology, and thus no longer even, to use your example of Mosul, the need for a specific site, but the ability to acquire that knowledge anywhere is a mounting challenge.
And I appreciate you referenced efforts to deny Iran the ability to secure weapons of mass destruction. But how is that going to be achieved with the financial resources that they have now? I'm just very concerned.
So the agreement that we have in place is certainly the most robust, peacefully negotiated agreement we've ever had specific to their nuclear program. What that does give us is the ability to engage with Iran, which is important, and again, I think goes to the initial prevention side of our strategy, which is to prevent any nation or any actor from acquiring WMDs. So the transparency and engagement that we will now have should be helpful, but it certainly will require vigilance continued from our intelligence community, all of our partners in the region, and certainly the Department of Defense
Well,
as well.
I'm concerned as they've continued with intercontinental ballistic missile development that they're just simply not trustworthy. Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, I want to thank our witnesses for the testimony today. As I mentioned in my opening statement, I'd like to hear more about the scientific, the institutional, and the cultural changes that the DoD is developing and implementing in response to the inadvertent anthrax shipments. Could you speak more to these changes and the lessons learned here?
Thank you very much. I'd be glad to start to address that. First of all, let me say that the anthrax incident is something that shouldn't have happened, and it's something that we have to make sure never happens again. And in order to do that, we do have to make those changes you just talked about. Starting with the technical side of things, it's been the findings of at least 2 investigations now that what was needed was a stronger scientific basis underpinning the inactivation protocols for anthrax. And in fact, we have put into effect now research studies that will add that scientific rigor to understand what it takes to inactivate the anthrax spore. Second part of the technical, again, there were several technical pieces to this, but the second most important part of the technical investigation had to do with the detection of viability. Because it's one thing to inactivate the spore, you also have to be able to confirm that the spores have been inactivated. And so the viability testing protocols are another part of the research that we have put into effect in the Chemical Biological Defense Program, and those will be applied only after they have been internally reviewed and externally reviewed by an independent scientific committee, so that we can make sure they have the technical integrity that will enable that kind of research to continue. Institutionally, the Army's Biosafety Task Force was not able to identify a specific person who was responsible for a specific action that caused the anthrax incident. However, they did uncover a number of cultural issues that really do need to be addressed, starting with what they characterized as complacency among the scientific and the managerial staff. In other words, there were indications that there were issues with the science, and the staff was accused of being relatively complacent by not more aggressively addressing those things that were uncovered. And so I think that a combination of replacing some of the technical members, replacing the managerial members, as well as instituting a culture of accountability and technical integrity will go a long way. And I think it's our responsibility to help make sure that those are actually accomplished. Right. Organizationally, the United States Army has stepped up, and they have been identified, they've been tagged as the executive agent for biosecurity in the department. And that responsibility is going to fall under the Surgeon General of the Army. And so things are being reorganized such that the direct oversight of biological safety in the laboratories will be overseen by the Office of the Surgeon General.
Very good. Well, those are positive changes in the right direction, and I hope they'll continue as such. This is too serious an issue not to do that. Also, as I mentioned in my opening statement, I support the Blue Ribbon Panel's recommendations on strengthening cybersecurity on systems with biological pathogen information. What's the department's thought on this issue, and what steps is the department taking to secure its systems?
Thank you, Congressman. I had the opportunity to watch the hearing that our former colleague, Jerry Parker, appeared at. And I have to be honest, I agreed with much with what Jerry had to say. This recommendation in particular is obviously one that we're taking very, very seriously. It's one the department has taken seriously overall, even beyond the Chem Biodefense program, in an extremely serious manner. A very large portion of this year's budget is dedicated to cyber defense and the like. I do not have numbers here in front of me today to share with you specifically in relation to your question, but if given the opportunity, I'd like to come back to you and to the other members with specific answer in terms of the amount of resources being put towards this issue.
Yeah, I'd very much like to see that follow-up, so thank you for that, and I look forward to the follow-up. My time's expired. I have other questions, but at this point, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman Langevin. We now proceed to Congressman Rich Nugent of Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the panel's attendance today. The Blue Ribbon Study Panel on Biodefense made several recommendations, one of which was to enhance public-private partnership in medical countermeasure development. If you could, please discuss DoD's larger plan to incorporate the study panel's findings, as well as touch upon the specific medical countermeasure issue, if you could, please.
Thank you very much for the question. First of all, let me say that we have read the Blue Ribbon Panel's report, and every one of the 33 recommendations is a positive step in the direction of strengthening biodefense. In discussion with our staff, we have identified a number that we've already started to step out on. And in particular, we were quite pleased to see the stress on medical countermeasure development. It's obviously something the nation needs, and it's very important to the Department of Defense. There were a number of recommendations in there that also talk about interagency collaboration, and that again is something that's borne out by recent experience with Ebola and others. That's something that can only do good things for the enterprise. Another area that we thought was especially helpful was a recommendation for rapid point-of-care diagnostics, something that again will speed up the process of recovery. One of the things we're doing in the department in order to come up with novel and agile manufacturing techniques is establishing an advanced development and manufacturing capability to address those things that are particular to the Department of Defense. And we think that will help a lot in the direction of implementing some of the panel's recommendations. Most importantly, though, I think it's the interagency collaboration. I think that what they essentially called for was for agencies, organizations who all have a stake in the biodefense field to collaborate and cooperate much more closely. And I think if we all take that seriously, I think we can strengthen the biodefense enterprise.
If I could add on to Dr. Hopkins' answer, two of the specific recommendations, obviously the public-private partnerships, but also the time in between events, between an Ebola outbreak and things like that. That was the opportunity for us to make significant progress in these areas. And I'll give you one example where I think we are already making good use of the recommendations that came from the Blue Ribbon Panel, and that's in regard to Ebola. Prior to the Ebola outbreak, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency had spent over $300 million on vaccine treatment research and development. So we had put the resources forward. Those resources went towards building a partnership. The first one was with a small corporation in California called the MAP Corporation. And they developed one of the drugs that's being tested right now in West Africa called ZMAP, and it's doing very, very well. And the third leg of that stool, if you will, was the government of Canada, who was also involved in terms of bringing important technology or technological contributions to what became ZMAP. So I share that example with you as we completely concur with the example that you laid out there, and we're trying to apply those things daily in approaching these and responding to these difficult biological threats.
One of the recommendations, I believe, from that panel was also to invest more in medical countermeasures. Are we doing that? Are we investing more? Or are we staying status quo?
Since the report just came out.
I realize that. It's kind of...
Certainly our emphasis is going to be to invest more. I just can't say how much at this point, but given the stress that the Blue Ribbon panel put on it and given the lessons learned from Ebola, our emphasis will be on putting more money into that area.
Obviously, there's things popping up all the time. Zika virus down, in the Caribbean is a threat. At least it will be a threat to Florida, and we're concerned about that, obviously. And what a great, if you could weaponize that. I mean, what it does to newborns, infants, is unbelievable. So I think, Mr. Chairman, I appreciate the time. My time's almost expired, and I want to thank the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sheriff Nugent. We now proceed to Congressman Brad Ashford of Nebraska.
Yeah, thank you for this, and thank all of you. And I appreciate the comments about Ebola. Obviously, the University of Nebraska Medical Center was a major player. In fact, has the largest biocontainment unit in the Ebola area, and to Congressman Nugent's point about public-private partnerships, UNMC continues to grow its efforts and expanding the training center, and has a desire to continue to expand it. And it's interesting, going back to Dr. Phil Smith, who actually developed the idea of biocontainment at UNMC 12 years ago, and then working on it for a period of 10 years. And then the Ebola crisis hit, we were ready to go. And those patients were brought to UNMC. The city of Omaha and state of Nebraska participated in making sure that, on the fly, we were able to put procedures in place to get those patients to UNMC. And in all but one case, we were successful in bringing them back. So I think there are a lot of lessons there. Let me, in the blue, and you mentioned training, I think, would you comment, and either of you, any of the three of you comment on, I agree that training is very important in all medical facets, but how does that in practice going to work? We need to be able to train a lot more people to deal, and the Ebola crisis did sort of highlight sort of the lack of training that was immediately available, but that is now beginning to become available. So how do we enhance that training as we move forward? And whomever would like to respond.
So I'll take a first stab at it, and then let my colleagues add on to it. I think there's two ways to look at training. I think obviously first and foremost, and I think this is what you're referring to, Congressman, is the domestic training. How do we help prepare first responders, hospital staffs, civil support teams, National Guard, if you will, those who would be responding? How do we prepare them for this eventuality or possibility, if you will? On the other side of the equation is what can we be doing overseas to train partners and allies to be better able to deal with these threats as far from American shores as possible. In both of these areas, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency is playing a role. We are providing training, we are providing advice, we are providing subject matter expertise to a lot of these entities who would be involved in first response. Organizations and hospitals like the University of Nebraska are true gems. I mean, that's what is going to be required in some of these events. And given my relationship and participation in the STRATCOM chain of command, I am well aware of what a jewel you have there in Nebraska. But the other side of the equation is, what can we be doing today to help prepare our partners and allies to detect, potentially helps begin to respond to these outbreaks overseas? You know, one of the things I think we learned from the Ebola outbreak is that the more we're able to help prepare those first responders, those hospital staffs, give them the tools that they need to detect and begin to work on it, the better off we're going to be here. So I think it's a two-phase approach.
Yes.
If I could just add on, echo everything that Director Myers offered, but also would highlight the important work of the Global Health Security Agenda, which has brought together now 50 nations across the globe. Excellent effort at getting, again, across first responders, military, and so on. So it's not just a DoD initiative, but a presidential initiative initially, to bring those countries together to meet health regulations, to identify training gaps, which then enable us to identify whether the United States could appropriately fill that gap, a different partner, and looking to regional models where we can draw on a regional strength to also address some of the concerns that have arisen. So it does take it away from our borders where possible, but is also now a global effort, which is fantastic.
Yes, sir. Doctor.
I would just like to add that the Department of Defense will bring very important and very effective training capabilities, both domestically as well as internationally. I think one of the key lessons learned from Ebola experience, though, is that it takes multiple agencies and it takes a lot of collaboration. So our partnering with the Department of Health and Human Services will be essential in order to make sure that that training is as widespread and as effective as it can be.
Sir.
Congressman, one last thing to add. When I started in this position 6.5 years ago, and you had told me one of the most important relationships and valuable relationships and closest relationships that I have is with the director of the Centers for Disease Control, I wouldn't have believed it. But I think that the events and the threats that we're dealing with today has driven that into reality. And Tom Frieden and I are in contact on a regular basis to make sure that DTRA and the CDC are working hand in glove in unison, make sure there's no overlap and there's no gap, and that we're complementary.
Thank you, and I do appreciate the fact that the Congress put language in the omnibus that expanded the reach of some of these efforts. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman Ashford. We now proceed to Congressman Trent Franks of Arizona.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here today. It's always encouraging when we are able to speak to people who have a kind of a comprehensive view of some of these things. And I guess my first question, I know you've talked a lot about some of the chemical and biological consideration. That'll be my second question. My first question is related to the what area of nuclear proliferation gives you the most concern? You know, I guess Iran that might gain a capability to potentially utilize even a nascent nuclear capability for EMP attacks or something along those lines. What, in terms of the nuclear issues out there, Pakistan, whatever it might be, tell us what you think, and I'll start with you, Dr. Hopkins. What is the area of greatest concern to you that could translate to be dangerous to our country?
Thank you for that question. The thing that would keep me awake at night is being able to detect the fact that nuclear proliferation is happening in the first place. Proliferation of the technologies, proliferation of the materials is something that's that we have to be on top of. And given the knowledge that has been proliferated, and given the fact that there are multiple places where there are materials out there, I think first and foremost we have to have the ability to be able to detect the action of proliferation right from the outset.
Any area of special concern? Any state or non-state actor that has you most concerned?
Well, at this point, given what's in the headlines, it would be in North Korea.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Myers?
Thank you, Congressman. For me, I would say it's the intersection of nuclear weapons and fissile material with terrorist organizations. Mm-hmm. I mean, that to me is an absolute crucial problem because A, it's very difficult to determine who got it, how they got it, where they got it from, where they might be taking it. There is no known source or location, capital, or what have you. That would be my answer to the question.
Dr. Smith.
Sir, mine probably is a combination of the three, in the sense that I do believe from a state perspective, North Korea represents the greatest threat. We have seen just provocative, destabilizing actions across that nuclear portfolio, most recently and even over the past many years, as you're well aware. But particularly to Dr. Hopkins' point, North Korea is also a known proliferator. So to the extent that some of the initiatives, the Proliferation Security Initiative, other regimes can both be aware of those activities and prevent them, or detect activities even within North Korea, I think is critical. And then certainly, as you've heard in my remarks, the non-state actor expressed interest, is demonstrated interest now in the use of CBRN. We haven't seen it on the N side of that equation, but that's certainly an area of concern. And again, they've expressed openly that that's an intent. So,
Well, I think that's one of the main concerns some of us have. The vaunted agreement that we had with North Korea was supposed to vitiate that danger, and of course now we're facing it in spades. And it occurs to me, then, looking at the two agreements, the one with North Korea as opposed to the one with Iran, that the one with North Korea was a much stronger agreement. So you have to forgive me for not being as calm about the whole thing as it may be. But then let me shift the second question. In terms of non-nuclear threats, what keeps you at night in that regard? And I'll start again with you, Dr. Hopkins, and we'll see if we can get to the end here.
Well, thank you again. By far, the potential for the proliferation and use of biological threats is number one.
In any particular area?
Given what I know about our capability to provide protection against conventional threats, I would be concerned about genetic modifications of various potential threats.
I concur with Dr. Hopkins completely. That's exactly my concern.
and again, I think sort of twofold. There's both a current and a future threat. The future threat, I would concur with the gentleman to my right. From a current threat, again, in the field, we've seen ISIL use of chemicals as weapons. That's certainly an area of concern for me from both a chemical and a biological threat.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Vice Chairman Franks. And we now proceed to Congressman Ryan Zinke of Montana.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for being here. I guess, Dr. Smith, the launching of the 2 ICBMs, do you see that as a violation of the UN resolutions?
Specifically to North Korea's recent launch?
No, the Iranian.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, in both cases, then I'll say yes. Those are.
What was our action?
So my office is not responsible for the UN security resolutions.
Do you know of any U.S. action taken against that?
I'm sorry, I don't, but I can certainly get back to you on that.
When Dr. Hopkins, you had mentioned one of your greatest fears is to evaluate testing and whether or not they're cheating or testing or inspections. Have you read the International Atomic Energy Agency and Iranian agreement in regards to testing protocol?
No, I haven't.
Do you know of anyone in your department that has?
Certainly.
By name?
Our Nuclear Matters Office.
Are you in charge? So do you think that Congress should have a copy of that? Because I don't know if anyone in Congress has read it.
Well, assuming we're talking about the same document,
I think we are.
Should have it.
I think so too. Because my concern is that I agree with you. North Korea is a threat. I also agree with Iran is a threat. But it becomes even more of a threat if we don't take action of something. And we're all concerned about weapons of mass destruction. And I fought in the desert, and I directly understand the threat. But North Korea is not tweeting the destruction of Israel. North Korea is not tweeting the destruction of the great Satan, us. Iran is. I don't think we have. Do you think we have the inspection protocols that we could have some assurance that Iran is not skirting the agreement?
I don't have enough knowledge about the protocols to judge the effectiveness.
Ms. Smith?
So can't speak to that except to say that there's certainly a commitment from both the United States Department of Defense, intelligence community, and other partners to carefully monitor and verify. And the program, the joint program is set up to support that. So we should identify issues of any abrogation.
Let me turn to the border, southern border. How much of a threat do you think our southern border is for infiltration of weapons of mass destruction, particularly chemical? Dr. Hopkins?
The potential threat is probably coincident, probably about as strong as the threat from bringing in illicit drugs. From what I understand, the networks that would be used, that might be used, would be ones that would capitalize on the existing infiltration routes.
Mr. Myers, do you share that same opinion?
Yes, sir. When you look at the paths that these terrorist organizations use, they're using the same paths, whether they're moving illegal contraband, illegal drugs, human trafficking, or what have you. It's difficult to believe they would change their pattern of behavior to move another valuable asset, whether it be weapons of mass destruction or the like. So yes, I would agree. This is one of the reasons that we spend an awful lot of time dealing with deeply buried targets and potential WMD pathways such as this. We have a specific R&D effort that is focused on finding, detecting, and then potentially eliminating, if the choice is made, to deal with those types of threats.
And Dr. Smith, do you, based on your knowledge of chemical, do you think it's more probable for homegrown chemical, or do you see chemical being transported across border as a principal threat?
So inherently, because of the chemical industry, there are certainly precursor chemicals that are commonly found easily around the globe for normal use. So the dual use question is certainly an issue there. So I would say both are of concern, but to the extent to which we're aware and are working with our partners to make them aware of those concerns related to toxic chemicals that may be part of normal industry is very critical.
And do we have the same monitoring in Mexico as we do in the U.S. as far as the chemical companies?
I can't speak to that. We can come back to you.
Okay. I'll yield the remaining part of my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman Zinke. We'll now proceed with the second round. Dr. Hopkins, the Blue Ribbon Study Panel on Biodefense noted that work dealing with cyber threats to pathogen security is nascent, and that the United States is not yet well positioned to address cyber threats that affect the biological science and technology sectors. Can you describe the cyber threat that you see to biological security? How is the Department of Defense addressing these biological security cyber threats?
Thank you very much. The cyber threats to the biological systems have to be handled through the process of defining hardness requirements, cyber hardness requirements for the systems, the communication systems, the diagnostics and devices that would be used. We have to start doing that. We have to build them in and basically get away from the legacy systems that may not be as strong in that area.
And I believe a vote's being called. One real quick question, Mr. Myers, before you run off. Director, the Department of Defense played a large role in the U.S. government response to Ebola. What do you think is an appropriate role for the Department of Defense in other global epidemics such as Ebola? And as you depart, what role would you recommend the Department of Defense to play in the recent Zika virus as cited by Sheriff Nugent?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. When it comes to the Zika virus, obviously our colleagues at the Department of Health and Human Services have the lead. The Defense Threat Reduction Agency, parts of the Chemical Biological Defense Program that Dr. Hopkins oversees, are standing by in support through the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Health Affairs at the Department of Defense, so we're standing by to support. On the larger issue of epidemics like Ebola, I believe that Congress has provided the Defense Threat Reduction Agency and others with some significant tools that can be brought to bear in these things. Specifically, I'm referring to the Nunn-Lugar CTR program. That was the tool we used to help respond to the Ebola threat. You've given us the flexibility, you've given us the authorities to go out and do some incredible things in these places. I think that is going to continue to be a very effective tool. I think it is one that the Secretary and the President will turn to in some of these events and situations. And quite frankly, I think the program is going to be used for more and more of these types of things because of the authorities that Congress has provided us.
Well, thank you very much, and we now proceed to Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The CWMD systems organization, as we've touched upon, is developing a prototype situation awareness tool constellation. And Dr. Hopkins, you spoke about this briefly in your opening statement, to provide a platform for sharing information across security domains, supporting various communities of interest. What efforts have been taken to eliminate duplication with other CWMD systems, and how is Constellation leveraging other large-scale data tools?
Thank you very much for that. First of all, Constellation is using the most up-to-date technology possible in order to make sure that that the very ambitious attempt to try to integrate and synthesize and report weapons of mass destruction related activities can actually be accomplished. And it's focusing very, very heavily on identifying the specific user requirements to make sure that it is useful. If I could, since Defense Threat Reduction Agency is actually doing the development, I'd like to ask Mr. Myers to add.
Certainly.
Congressman, I know our time is short, but I'll try and condense this. We are leveraging the DISA big data platform as one of the ways that we're kind of using the technology that is already in place to make sure that we're not duplicating efforts elsewhere. Similarly, we are working very closely with the Strategic Capabilities Office, the part of the Office of Secretary of Defense, to field Constellation on the next generation of the tactical cloud environment. So those are two specific steps that we're taking to utilize technology that's already in place and not duplicate something that has already been invested in and working well. Furthermore, I think the other important part of this is the requirements. Where did we get them? Who defined what Constellation will do and what won't it do? First and foremost, in 2013, STRATCOM put together a Situational Awareness Senior Warfighter Forum, something called a SWARF. Brought all the combatant command services and potential customers of Constellation together. They compiled a good list of what they needed from this tool, what the tool that we were creating needed to provide to them if it was going to be useful. So that was another way we went about defining that. And obviously, since then, we've developed a concept of operation, and an office under Dr. Hopkins has been providing us implementation guidance. And each and every time we put the implementation guidance together, and every time we look at that ConOps, we're constantly scanning the horizon, because if there is no need to build a wheel and we can use someone else's, we will. At this time, we believe we are taking full opportunity and advantage of technology that's already in place to put this necessary capability together.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you for that. One of the stated goals of the Constellation CWMD Situational Awareness Tool is to be able to share information among different organizations, both within the United States government and between our allies. How have the requirements for Constellation been developed and validated?
Well, the first part of the answer would be the SWARF that I mentioned, and brought all the combatant commands and the services together. But one comment I would make about your question is, we're going to be operating on 4 different levels simultaneously. We're going to be talking about an open system where we could communicate with international organizations. We're talking about what we call in the Department of Defense our NIPRNet, as well as SIPRNet on the secret level and on the top secret level as well. So one of the difficulties we're having is, or we're trying to overcome, is how do you operate on all 4 levels simultaneously to make sure this tool is useful not only for Department of Defense, but our interagency partners, but also our international partners. I think one of the lessons learned from Ebola was the portal that we were able to put together, which is kind of an early version, much smaller version of Constellation, getting our international partners, the World Health Organization, some of the national governments involved, and all of us on the same page in terms of being able to share information and have it located in one place, turned out to be absolutely critical. It allowed us to coordinate the assistance quicker and much more effectively.
So does it interact with, or will it interact with World Health as well as CDC, as well as Department of Defense assets?
Yes, sir. But it would probably be on 3 different levels, though. I mean, obviously, we would, on the open level, we would be able to work with our international partners. Our friends down at the Centers for Disease Control, we'd be able to work with them on any of the 3 levels, and obviously within Department of Defense, we'd be able to do it from the unclassified level all the way to the top secret level, and similarly, not only with the CDC, but our partners at the Agency for International Development at the State Department. That's really what we expect to get out of this. That's what we're hoping for.
Very good. Thank you. Well, my time has expired. I appreciate the answers and your testimony. Again, Mr. Myers, wish you well, and thank you all for your service. You're back, Mr. Chairman.
And thank you, Congressman Langevin, and it's very fitting that we would end on a high note with Congressman Rich Nugent.
Mr. Chairman, you're always a joy. I appreciate it. We got to have a little levity, folks. As we talk about CBRN, and particularly as we work with our allies in Europe now, they're obviously facing huge migration issues coming across. Are our allies, our NATO allies in particular, are they up to speed in regards to CBRN, in regards to dealing with those issues?
So, sir, I'll address that first, and then perhaps Dr. Hopkins, you might want to add in. But we work closely, so through the OSD Policy Office, work closely both in very important bilateral engagements as well as some multilateral engagements with our partners, and then certainly NATO in and of itself is an important part of that equation as well. So I would say in some areas we offer more strengths than they do, and in other areas they have strengths that we don't. And I mean that both broadly and both to the defense community itself, but also in some cases academia and the NGO and scientific communities in the countries from which those partners draw often have strengths that support ours. So where I'll turn it over is we work at both executive levels, sort of senior steering groups, and then individual issue managers or working groups, where on an annual basis, depending on the topical area, we will set priorities for what we believe are the current or emerging areas.
My question is really, do we have protocols in place if we're today in Europe and we're responding to a crisis with Polish troops? Do we have cross-training in regards to CBRN?
Congressman, a great example. We have had specific training with the Polish military forces just in the last 18 months, specifically through the Chem Bio Defense Program, through our S&T efforts there. So yes, I mean, I don't think it'd be fair to characterize it as uniform across. Dr. Hopkins and I and Dr. Smith spent an awful lot of time with the United Kingdom, our relationship there, as well as colleagues in France. We have a special relationship in terms of CBRNI cooperation with NATO. So yes, we have got deep relationships. I would not say it's uniform and even across the board. There are pros, there are cons, there are heights, there are lows. But I think we've got good, strong relationships with all of our partners who have specific and significant capabilities in this area.
Yes, sir.
If I could just add, in addition to the partnerships and the agreements, we also do a burden sharing to an extent in the research and development area for chemical and biological defensive measures with a number of nations.
And to take that one step further, many of the nations that I've mentioned make significant contributions to the non-Luger CTR program. When we're doing non-proliferation or counter-proliferation programs with foreign partners, our allies in Europe and elsewhere may not be able to duplicate or do the training themselves, but they'll make monetary contributions that the non-Luger CTR program can take and funnel into the program to offset some of the costs to the Department of Defense. And that's another way we've really built those partnerships. I have specifically Germany in mind in a number of cases over the last 12 to 18 months.
Well, you know, my concern obviously is on the battlefield if exposed to some kind of a biological or chemical attack. If we don't, if we have the antidote or whatever it may be to treat, or the Polish troops have it and we don't, can we share that?
Actually, thank you for the question. Actually, we can, and we do.
Okay.
In fact, with NATO, we actually share a common challenge standard to make sure that our masks, suits, gloves, individual protection, collective protection, decontaminants, all can meet the same standards.
Very good. Well, I appreciate your time, and I appreciate your answers, and thank you very much. Now, I yield back for my remaining time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Congressman Nugent. And again, thank each of you for being here today, and Director Myers, best wishes to the future. And I share the concern of Congressman Zinke, and that is that we're facing irrational enemies who truly believe in a policy and a course of death to America, death to Israel. And so your agencies, your departments have never been more important. And however, in a bipartisan manner, we can work together to protect American families. And with that, we are adjourned.